it there. This is not a question that's urgent in your own life, unless you're given lots of training to think it might be and ought to be, which some of you have gotten that training, and I feel sadly for you, but I understand that, and that's okay. It's important to you, and far be it from me to disrupt your psychology here, but no, the government is faced with the alternative, which is, and that's really in a sense your question, what happens if you actually did, by the way, what the private enterprise economics that I was taught, that I'm supposed to be teaching, but of course I had much more fun by making fun of it, I'm supposed to be teaching, says that, it's a private enterprise, and if it can't go anymore, if it's made mistakes, if it's made bad investment, if it can't, that's what a private, bye-bye, into the toilet you go. And then we're supposed to believe, remember what we did the first couple days of this class, then we're supposed to believe that this is that weeding out process, that kind of, remember the metaphor I gave you of those nature movies where the herd of antelope are running across and the nasty panther catches one because that one is slow or sick, and so you're supposed to feel good as you watch the poor animal being eaten alive, that this is good for the herd as a whole, because you don't want those bad genes in that weak one to be continued in the blah blah. So we should all sit there and say, bye bye Citibank, bad gene, you're out. Can't do that. Why not? Because too many people have dependence on that company. Just to give you an example, Citibank used its enormous wealth and prestige to borrow huge amounts of money, issuing bonds. So you could lend to the Citibank. You had a AAA rating. It was a secure loan. So now you are I'll pick something for you that you would enjoy. You are the hospital for sick children in Boise, Idaho. And your endowment that keeps your hospital going is there invested in Citibank bonds that you've been holding for 30 years. So now you've got a choice. If you let Citibank go bye-bye, and then the bonds are worthless because you got a bankrupt company that doesn't have to pay on its bonds because that's what bankruptcy means, then the Boise Hospital for Crippled Children closes, and all the little cripples are thrown out in the snow, right? We can't, it's very interesting. What do we do, right? We don't, as a nation, we have a problem. We do not want to see front page of the Daily News little crippled children in the snow. We don't want it. We don't know how to cope with that. That's a problem. So we won't let that happen. The political leadership who are going to have to stand there and take the heat for this, they don't want that. So you can't. Maybe more honestly, it's not so much about the crippled children in Boise, it's about 50 other large corporations, including many other banks, that also hold these things. And if you let them go, they're going to have to declare bankruptcy, and then countless depositors are not going to get their money, or the government's going to have to make all that up, and the government hadn't planned on spending all that. Boom, boom, boom. So at this point, the government is in a salvage operation. It's actually saying to itself, which is greater? Letting them go, like Citibank, and then dealing with all of the cascading problems that will flow from that, or saving Citibank. And so far, they're deciding to save Citibank. Leading, of course, critics to say, maybe you didn't do that because it's the lesser evil. Maybe you're hooked up with Citibank, want to save them at the price of everybody else and so forth. The herky-jerkiness of the government was shown because it wasn't that long ago that we had a very big bank called Lehman Brothers, which was allowed to die. They were refused what is now, in retrospect, a small amount of money. $6 billion roughly would have kept them going. And they were told, it's the way it is. You're a 120-year-old bank, been here a long time, you're very well connected. Too bad. Bye-bye, you die. That led to such problems because it turned out all kinds of institutions around the world held the debt of Lehman Brothers, did business with Lehman Brothers, expected Lehman Brothers to play all kinds of roles in deals that had been made and that were ongoing. All of that came to a crashing halt. And the fallout from that was considered to be so bad that it traumatized the Paulson and the Treasury. And that has carried over because it was Paulson's deputy who was, after all, the Treasury Secretary now, the one who headed the Federal Reserve Bank here in New York, Geithner. So they were all so badly shocked by this event that they don't want to let anything go now, but for fear. Best example, we're going to do a little bit later today, is better than Citibank, is the AIG insurance company. But I'm going to deal with that as an important example. But these are all now government entities. The AIG is not a private company, whatever. It's just not. And nor is Citibank, nor is Bank of America. None of them. I mean, they keep hobbling along, but the government owns them for all practical purposes. They can't do anything unless the government tells them. They can't do anything that the government tells them not to do. So are they technically independent still? Yes. Do they make the decisions? No. So nationalization, it's America. So nationalization is a reality, but we pretend by not saying we haven't done it, it isn't there. Okay? That's like saying you're winning the war in Iraq. No, it's verbalization. What? That we won in Vietnam, or that we're really doing well in Afghanistan. These are pretend things. You can't. It's sad. It's sad because it really doesn't help in the long run to pretend like this. It doesn't solve the problem. Doesn't get you out of the situation. Doesn't do these things. Usually keeps you in longer than you should, and you see that later retrospectively. But the trick is to figure it out first, before things hit the fan, which is now my favorite phrase. Let's pick up where we left off. I want to make sure we were all on the same page, since it was 2 weeks ago, that we're dealing with the watershed of the 1970s, first from the point of view of the mass of working people, and then from the point of view of the employer. First the employee, then the employer. To remind you what we did with the employees first, we went through this remarkable history of American consumerism and consumption, the fact that real wages in America rose from 1820 to 1970, and then stopped for the reasons that we went through, that the American working class was traumatized by this event, all the more so because it wasn't conscious. It wasn't dealt with as a conscious, explicit problem that we needed to talk about and discuss what options we as a working people had to cope with it. None of that happened. It was kind of left to each individual to discover it for himself or herself and to navigate in his or her personal life and family how to cope. And we now know retrospectively that the two major coping mechanisms were doing more work, more hours of labor, having more members of the household go out and do more hours of paid labor, on the one hand, and borrowing money up the wazoo on the other hand. And producing 25 years later, say moving from 1975 to the millennium year 2000, producing a population that had become physically exhausted by all the work, had become emotionally stressed by the disintegration of the family, since the big change in labor was the labor of the women, who went out of the household and did paid labor and proved themselves incapable of handling both a full-time job outside and holding together the family as they had been doing before. That meant family life disintegrated and became more difficult for everybody in a variety of ways, putting enormous stress on people. And finally, the burden of debt rising so quickly meant enormous anxiety, understandably, that anything that might happen to interfere with your income would bring a crash of your indebtedness that you could no longer sustain down around your head. So you were worried about your debts, you were facing a dissolving home life, and your wages weren't going up anymore. And it brought the working class of America, by the beginning of this century, to a state of physical exhaustion and psychological stress. That meant that no more work could be done, that personal life was in serious disarray and beginning to interfere with work, and that the debt was meaning that a larger and larger portion of your income could not be used to buy objects because you were using more and more of it simply to pay back your accumulated debt. Okay. I want to turn then to the employer class and focus mostly on how this whole experience looks from that side. And to do that, I want to remind you again of this simple graph, the 1820, 1970, 2009. This is the productivity, the amount of goods and services per hour of American workers' labor. And underneath it, the story of wages, which looks like that. In other words, around the 1970s, the rise in wages per hour of work levels off, trails slightly down, but basically flattens out, so that the distance between gets larger and larger. And that distance between is the difference between the amount of stuff produced by a worker in an hour kept rising, but the amount of payment you gave to that worker, who became ever more productive, stayed the same. Therefore, the difference between what the worker produced for the employer to sell and what the employer had to give the worker to come there and do it got wider and wider. That difference here we're going to call, because it's the basis of it, profit. So the most important thing for you to see is that the last 30 years have been a profit bonanza for employers. They have been able to arrest the long-term growth of real wages. And by the way, this is, again, not an act of nastiness on the part of employers. It is not something undertaken to deviously abuse people. It is a response of the employers to the conditions of the labor market that we went through before. Remember, we talked about women going to the labor force. We talked about computerization that reduced the demand for labor. We talked about export of jobs, and so on. Was there a question?
Yeah, I remember last time we talked about that.